we're going to hop into an article written by Tara, an article that I really saw myself in. I have been married a little over a year now, and definitely could feel some of what you were talking about in your article. So this article is called Seeing Red, when all you feel toward your spouse is anger, which it kind of sounds sad that I can understand that, but I can. And I think that most people who are married can understand feeling that way
For sure.
at one point. Right. So I would love if we could just talk through starting out, who did you write this article to, and what is your hope for it?
Yeah, yeah. So in the article, like you'll notice, like basically there's a lot of like male pronouns. Like it's almost like we're kind of written for women about male husbands, but totally you could like switch that, and it could totally go either way. But essentially, this is for couples that just feel. People who feel really stuck in their relationship, where they're like almost that, that sense of like, if you could just grab them and shake them and just make them see what you're trying to say, like it's for those people who just feel like they're at that like really desperate place. They're at their wits' end. They've gotten furiously angry at their spouse, and maybe they live in that place, or maybe they've just visited that place. Like I think a lot of us have visited that place. But they just, it's not working. Like no, like it's basically like they've used every tool in their tool belt, and it's not working, and they're just in that place of like desperation. And so this article is written for them. And if anger is like has become your default, if anger has become like your go-to, this article was written for you.
That's good. If anger has
Mhm.
become your default, I
Mhm.
love that. And I think it's so much more easy. It sounds so twisted, but it's easier to get angry and upset at a spouse or someone you love dearly or a close person to you
Mhm.
than anybody else. It's
For
just
sure.
so easy
Mhm.
to explode at your spouse over something small, that maybe was just a trigger or something. I mean, it's so easy. And
Mhm.
I think this is a great article. And I mean, I was reading through it and I was like, "Ooh, I've done that. Ooh, I feel that. Yes, need to work on that." Like it was good. So I think that this article could be written for anybody who,
Mhm.
is married and struggles with some anger every so often. It happens.
Mhm.
And it's gonna happen. We're broken people and this life is crazy and hard. And yeah, sometimes we have this like what's the word? Kind of anger towards somebody who it's not, you
Yes.
don't need to be
Yes.
angry at.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about this. You cover this a little bit in your article, but can you expand on how this even happens? Like, how do you go from that honeymoon butterfly stage to being married and like wanting to like rip your hair out? How do you like go from that to that?
Yeah, yeah. So, well, I think that we all kind of like in this process of falling in love, like I call it in the article, I call it like having like wearing these rose-colored glasses, right? Like we kind of go into marriage with like, Disney has done us in, like we all kind of go in thinking it's going to be like happily ever after, right?
Moving
And we
into a
go
castle with my prince.
right, exactly, right. And so we think that that's how it's going to be, and in reality it doesn't go that way, because like you just said, like we're all broken, we're all broken people, and we bring that brokenness into our relationship. And so oftentimes, like we like John Gottman, who's famous researcher in marriage and couples therapy. But one of the things that he talks about is bids for attention, right? So we all are looking for bids for attention, bids for affection. We need to know that we matter to our person, right? And so we put these little bids out, and it might be, in the article I talk about like the little like come and get me wink, the gentle caress, the hey honey, do you think that maybe you could put your laundry in the hamper and not next to it, right? Like something as simple as that, right? And we start out with these really like innocent asks, right? So we need something, we ask for it. But then like life happens, right? We don't stay in that like honeymoon phase, right? So life happens, and it might be we have a child, it might be things shift at work, it might be a loss or a trauma that we didn't see coming, but all of a sudden just like the landscape shifts, and those little kind of flirtatious or innocent asks are kind of either disregarded or they're minimized or they're not noticed, right? And so we up the ante, and so we go from, something like I said, innocent and flirtatious, and then it gets a little bit worse. And it's, we kind of start to, it might turn into like a criticism or like nitpicking, right? It might end up looking like that. Nitpicking, criticism, that kind of thing. And then after that, like when those things don't work, that's when kind of like contempt comes in. And so contempt is when like we are aiming like at the personhood of our partner, right? Like we are aiming at them. Um, and so we will, like, it's kind of that like going for the jugular, like we will do and say the thing that hurts them. We'll take their weakness and we use it against them. And so all of this, like, it's like we're like turning it up and turning it up and turning it up until the point and just trying to make it hurt. And essentially they're all still bids for connection, bids for attention, affection. But they just become more and more critical, more and more intense as time goes on. And when they get ignored and when we don't feel like our partner sees us or hears us, it just gets, it gets worse and worse. And so yeah, that's how we just kind of turn it up. And that's how that flirtation turns to anger. The heart behind all of it is really the same, but that just kind of evolves over time.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna kind of bring myself into it a little
Mhm.
bit.
Sure.
And something that I thought of as I was reading it
Mhm.
is my husband is super laid back,
Mhm.
super relaxed, very go with the flow, happy go lucky.
Mhm.
And I love it about him because I am not like that.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah,
it's the
right.
perfect compliment.
Mhm.
Um, but I noticed that sometimes, I will get super frustrated or angry,
Mhm.
and react, really strongly to something.
Mhm.
And he, is pretty much always like very like low key, very relaxed. And so, it leads to me feeling very ashamed and like very like, why am I the only one who gets angry?
Mhm.
And so I guess my question would be, you know, is there something like wrong when, one person, one spouse is like super angry and upset and the other one is like totally chill, totally fine? Like, I mean, is there something wrong with that? Like, how do you address that, when the other
Yeah.
person doesn't even see any issue?
Mhm. Well, lots of different things like will go into that, right? So part of it is like the family that we grew up in, right? So if the family that we grew up in experienced more anger, then like I said, like kind of that anger being our default might have preceded our marriage, right? So maybe that's where we just go naturally, right? And so that we're going to be more inclined towards that in a relationship, right? And one of the things I talk about in the article is that, anger makes us feel big. It makes us feel big whenever we feel, when we feel small. It makes us feel, vivid when we feel invisible. It makes us feel heard whenever we feel like we're not being heard. And so part of, the desire of anger is to it's to motivate, right? We want to create change. And so we create change almost like a bulldozer creates change, like that's what anger does. And so I mean, the reason why your anger intensifies, or anybody in a similar situation, is that it's like that trying to move in an immovable object, right? And the more immovable the object is, the more we up the ante, the more we up the anger. And so it's not uncommon at all for one person to feel really, really angry and be left with lots of guilt and shame, and the other person to be kind of unmoved, right? Because the ask isn't working, right? I imagine you don't probably start with anger. You probably start with asking, right? And then it turns into anger. And so, no, not uncommon at all. Not uncommon at all. And so I think that part of that is, can we get back to like the basics of communication? Just that like ask and answer, I don't want, and, one of the things I encourage clients to do, and I would encourage you for it too, is to like open up your world, open up your heart to your spouse and just, hey, this is what I notice that I'm doing. And I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be that way, right? Letting them into like kind of your inner world and just say like, you know, if you could do these things, earlier, or if we can work on these things together, I know that you're super laid back, but I need these things to be done, and I don't want to be critical, and I don't want to get angry. And so can we work together to try to figure this out? Right. And so I think that's a very common place to be. And I think that it's not difficult to get out of that if both people can really listen, right? If we can really hear each other and see each other.
Yeah, that's so good. That's such good advice. I need to like write that entire thing out and put it up on a mirror for when I get when I have my moments. Oh my goodness. But you mentioned in your article that anger is just the tip of the iceberg. Can you
Mhm.
expand on what that kind of means?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So what I mean by that is like anger it's the tip of the iceberg because it's the thing that everybody can see. It's really obvious, it's really noticeable, right? When someone's angry, like everyone typically people will know, right? Whether it's like, some people like break out in hives, some people just like you can hear it in their tone of voice, right? There's these little shifts. And so anger is like the automatic thing that everyone around you kind of notices, right? And that's what you might be feeling in the moment. It is all encompassing, right? Anger is very encompassing. But there's usually a lot more underneath anger, and we call anger a secondary emotion. And what that means is that oftentimes there is a much more vulnerable, a much more soft emotion underneath it that has kind of gotten touched on, but those places are oftentimes also very painful for us. Um, the definition of vulnerability is the ability to be wounded. And so when we have been vulnerable in the past and we have been wounded, we've learned to not let ourselves stay in that place. And so anger kind of comes on top of that primary emotion of whatever's underneath that, and it like protects us from feeling that. But if we could remove and kind of peel back, that tip of the iceberg, or that layer of that secondary emotion, usually what we would find there is something much softer, like sadness, right? Like sadness that this is our marriage now, right? Or this is our relationship now. Like I remember when it was so easy. I remember when, we really enjoyed each other. And now, we're just stuck in this place. We're stuck in this dance, this cycle that we can't seem to get out of, right? So there's oftentimes there's sadness there. Um, Another easy one is like guilt, right? That I don't want to feel guilty for what I'm doing because he made me do it, right? But if we really could pull back the he made me do it or she made me do it, we would have to sit with our own guilt and really look at ourselves in the mirror for the way that we behave whenever we get angry, right? And then another possibility, and oftentimes this is kind of the deepest part of the iceberg, is fear. Just this fear that I'm going to be alone, fear that it's not going to work, fear that, like I said, all my cards are on the table. I've used every tool in my tool belt and nothing is shifting, nothing is changing, right? It's that desperation, and I'm going to end up being alone. And even if whether I'm alone inside the marriage or I'm alone because of divorce, I'm still alone because even if I'm inside the marriage, there's not a connection there. Or I have to figure out life by myself, and I don't want to do that because I really meant till death do us part when I said it. Right. And so there's this kind of like this deep fear that I'm never going to be like deeply known, deeply seen, heard, understood. And that fear of just, we aren't created to be alone. And so, God created us for community. And oftentimes that is very much at the root of things. And if you have children, oftentimes it's fear for them as well, right? Because those of us who grew up in divorced or broken homes, we don't want that for our kids. And so, just fear of the implications of having to do life alone, whether it's within the marriage or outside of the marriage.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I mean, I think of, the core emotions, and how a lot of, emotions are kind of linked to each
Mhm,
other, and kind
mhm,
of go up the chain.
mhm,
Um, but yeah, I really see that like fear part, as being something very significant, that happens, in those emotional responses,
mhm.
those angry reactions to things,
Yeah.
seeing like fear kind of underlying that. I just want to talk through the end of your article. You give, 3 tips for creating that change, and learning to manage that anger that you might feel at times. Can you talk through each of those tips and kind of expand on each one?
Yeah. So the first point that I make is, really looking at the state of our own hearts. I think this is really important because oftentimes we are so busy looking out. We're looking at our spouse, looking at our partner. What are they doing? What are they not doing? What are they not doing enough of? What are they doing wrong, right? Our eyes look out. And so naturally, it's so easy to see them. But we've got to kind of take an intentional shift to look inside of ourselves, right? Um, we have to look at the state of our own hearts, because ultimately, we are going to be held accountable and responsible for our actions, for our words. And so, what are we doing, kind of in that? And what's happening in our own hearts, right? Is there bitterness there? Is there resentment there? Can we look at that and care for ourselves, right? Because I think our hope is that our spouse is going to care for us. And if we spend all of our attention there, right, then we are also not caring for us, and allowing the Lord to care for us in those and kind of those deep and hurt places as well. So I would say that's the kind of the first step. The second step, I think, is to put yourself in your spouse's shoes. Um, you know, a little bit of empathy and validation can go a long way, right? How did your spouse get to this place? Where did they learn this kind of tendency to pull away and withdraw? What happened that they don't feel safe to be able to even engage in the conversation, which is oftentimes what happens. And so, what's your spouse's story? Can you feel for them in that place? Can you put yourself on the receiving end of your own comments? Oftentimes these angry comments are critical, and they're contemptuous, and they are harsh. And so, like, imagine what it would be like to be on the receiving end of those, right? And can we shift that, right? Can we shift that? Yeah, and so I think in that place, that I think that helps us to develop some empathy in that. And then the last thing that I would say is do what only you can and own your part. For that, we what am I doing to contribute to this dynamic, right? I push, they pull away. I push, they pull away. So can I stop pushing, right? Can I stop with the criticisms? Can I look for good, right? Because we can intentionally focus on certain things, right? I can intentionally shift my gaze from outside to inside. I can intentionally shift my gaze from the negative to the positive, right? And so what can I do to contribute in a positive way to this cycle, to getting to that place of connection rather than disconnection? Remembering that, like, my spouse, like, bears the image of God, and as an image bearer of God, like, how am I treating them? If he saw them as worthy of the sacrifice of his son, can I, right? Can I see his value even when he doesn't do something as valuable to me? Can I see that he is valuable just as an image bearer, just as a human being, even when they're not doing what I want them to do, or being what I want them to be, or acting or saying the things I want them to say? Can I still see them as valuable, the way that the Lord does? And so those three pieces, that looking at my own heart, developing empathy, and putting myself in my spouse's shoes, and then doing what I can to own my part of the cycle, those three pieces can really make a world of difference on a relationship. It kind of shifts this kind of blame and looking out towards let's look at me, right? Let's soften the way that I see them, and let me own the part that I can. Yeah, and so those are kind of my three tips I give at the end of the article that I think can really shift the dynamic of a relationship.
Mm, so good. I can see why you specialize in, relational conflict, marriage counseling, things like that, because that is really, really good and really great advice. Love it. Thank you so much, Tara. I hope that was able to encourage some of the people watching, if this is an area that you struggle in, like I do sometimes.
We all do. We all do, girl. We've been there. I've been to the ugliest and back, and so thankful to be able to walk with couples in those places.